Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining today's crash course on our general annual license process, part one. This is the first of a three-part series, and then we'll follow it up with a Q&A session next Wednesday. As folks may or may not know, Ordinance number 187879 became effective on Friday, June 2nd. We're very thankful that this ordinance went into effect because it allows us to implement the annual application process for all applicants. The ordinance amended various sections of the Los Angeles Municipal Code regarding the regulation of commercial cannabis activity. Collectively, those amendments streamlined the annual licensing process for both retail and non-retail businesses. Just some high-level changes. First, the LAMC was updated so that the flow was in chronological order, starting with the pre-application review process and then going through annual licensure. We instituted a new operating permit component. We shifted the final inspection from before an annual license is issued until after an annual license is issued. This gives folks the opportunity to receive their annual license, begin the state's annual licensure process while working in parallel with building and safety, public health, the fire department on any local permitting requirements. And then of course, once you've received your state license and or any of your local permits, you could request the final inspection. And then once you pass your final inspection, you'll be issued an operating permit. Folks that have an annual license may lawfully operate with an annual license plus either temporary approval or an operating permit. We've granted some extensions of time for businesses that are requesting a relocation. Folks are going to have to unplant their flag within 180 days unless the relocation would not have an impact on another applicant. This ensures that people aren't creating buffers at two different locations at the same time to the detriment of other applicants. We've also built in a mechanism that would allow DCR to grant an extension of time for those relocations in 90-day increments, provided that it doesn't negatively impact another applicant. The public hearing notice was increased from 500 feet to 700 feet. To coincide with the 700-foot buffer for retail storefront activities. The sunset dates for various temporary approval processes were implemented. The department still has the ability to grant temporary approval on the annual application record, provided the applicant is able to demonstrate that they have either a state provisional license and or a state annual license. We reorganized Article 4, which is LAMC 104, so that the different commercial cannabis retail activities were within one section. And then we simplified the process for the delivery and non-retail activities so that the director has the discretion to grant annual licenses for those activities. One of the things that was added was the progressive enforcement tools, which would allow DCR to issue a notice to correct for minor violations, as opposed to the notice of violation and the heftier fines that go along with a minor, medium, and major violation. We also clarified that all records must be renewed annually. We are transitioning folks into the annual application process. We want to make sure that all records are maintained in the most current format, so that some of the digital dashboards, the automation, and then as well as the reporting can be done on a regular basis to better automate and make resources available to different stakeholders. So this was an important component of the amendments. And then we've also extended the period of time to refile from 1 year to 3 years. As previously mentioned, refiling went into effect in 2022. So any of the records that would have hit the 1 year mark were not closed out because of the extension to 3 years. So now I'm going to get into the basics of the annual licensing process. So on May 1st, 2023, DCR launched the annual license application process for businesses that had created their legal business entity record and had been issued 2023 temporary approval. For applicants that either had not received temporary approval or did not create their legal business entity record, we're in the process of generating annual application records for those applicants. Over the weekend, beginning last week on May 31st, we took down the licensing portal so that we could update the system to make the annual license application available to anybody who's completed the pre-application review process. So the licensing portal is back online. If you have a pre-application review record that was deemed eligible for further processing, when you click on the action required button, it will take you directly into the annual license application. And as mentioned, when you do submit the annual license application, if you meet the requirements to receive temporary approval, we still have a pathway to grant temporary approval on those records while doing the environmental analysis and working the record towards the issuance of an annual license and or a recommendation to issue an annual license. The update into the system is complete. We will be updating different elements of the system, but we don't have a plan to take the system down while we push out some of the other updates we have planned. How does the annual license application process differ from temporary approval? The annual license process is a longer process, but it does include the environmental analysis, which is a CEQA review for all businesses. And that's one of the big things the state is requiring as part of their annual application process, as well as renewing an existing provisional license, is to demonstrate you've made progress towards that environmental analysis. For the retail storefront businesses, there is a community meeting and public hearing component of the application process, which of course the temporary approval process didn't necessitate either the environmental review or the community meeting requirements for the retail storefront licenses. How quickly is this process going to be moving? Businesses that have a state provisional license are going to have to demonstrate that they've made significant progress in the annual licensure process in order to renew their provisional licenses. That means that you're going to have a notice of completion or some other evidence that DCR has completed drafting the environmental report for your specific business at your specific license location. If you can provide that evidence to the state, you'll have the opportunity to renew your state provisional license. If you do not provide that evidence, then of course the state may deny the renewal of the provisional license, force you to cease operations until you meet the dual licensing requirement and receive your state annual license. The state is requiring that all provisional license holders transition to their annual license process by 2025. The state will not be renewing state provisional licenses in calendar year 2025. So whatever date your provisional license expires in 2025, you need to make sure that you have an annual state license to continue operations. So as part of the process of opening up the annual application process, we're allowing folks to submit their LIC 4013 form, which is the project-specific description, which is what we base our environmental review upon. So again, the folks that already have the annual records have the ability to upload the form 4013 directly to their record. And then for folks that are going to be able to access the annual application process, you'll have access to your annual record later this week. So I'm just going to briefly run through the project-specific information form. The form itself has a number of fields that can be filled out based on a combination of information in ZEMIS, as well as your understanding of your proposed business premises. And the last page of the form provides a partial list of different categorical exemptions that may apply to your project. For our phase 1 and phase 2 applicants, the most common exemptions are the class 1 for existing facilities, and then the class 32 for infill development projects. Additionally, for phase 3 applicants, oftentimes people will qualify for a class 32 because it is an infill project. And basically they're just utilizing an existing building, and the use is similar to the use that previously existed at that location. For the annual license process, there are certain steps that applicants have to take before submitting their pre-application review record or entering the annual license process. The first, of course, is to make sure that they have an active business tax registration certificate, which is issued through the Office of Finance. And from there, they can create their legal business entity record. So we will be helping to facilitate the creation of legal business entity records for applicants that were in our pipeline that had not previously created the legal business entity record, because it is a prerequisite for us to create your annual license record. Again, additional information will be coming out later this week through the portal to let folks know once their legal business entity record and/or annual application record has been established. If you're a prospective applicant and you need to get information related to how to request a business tax registration certificate, you can find it on Module 1 of the Licensing 101 webinars that we did earlier this year. And once this PowerPoint is posted, there's actually the link within the PowerPoint that will take you right to that recording. For the legal business entity record, that's where information related to owners, indirect owners, primary personnel, financial interest holders, your authorized agent, that's where all of that information lives. Previously, DCR reviewed that information as part of each application. And for folks that were applying either for multiple activities or at multiple locations, that work was duplicative. So what we've done is we've created a standalone record to house all of that information, and modifications can be uploaded against that record. And once those changes are approved or accepted by the department, we have the ability to push those changes down to any application or license record underneath that business organization. For businesses that are pursuing activities that are subject to our social equity program, of course, we have the ability to do the social equity review for that particular record and vet to make sure that all of the documents are in compliance with 10420. And then from there, once we've completed the equity share review, that review will be valid for any of the applications and license records that you continue to apply for, provided you don't make any changes to the ownership, primary personnel, or financial interest holders for that record. So it gives us the opportunity to do the equity share review earlier in the process before an application is before us. And it also gives the businesses that are allowed to participate as part of the social equity program the opportunity to leverage that analysis to apply for multiple license types and at multiple locations without having to undergo a new review. The only time the review has to be amended is if there is a modification that changes the ownership or the makeup of the equity for that specific entity. The annual license application record is primarily going to consist of the project-specific information form so that we can do the environmental analysis. We will need to see an executed lease agreement or property deed, some kind of evidence of your legal right to occupy the location, your business premises diagram, the indemnification agreement, landowner attestations, one of which comes in as part of the pre-application review process, and then the other attestation comes in as part of the application process. And then, of course, the no alcohol or tobacco attestation, because you can't sell tobacco or alcohol at a location that's licensed to engage in commercial cannabis activity. So basically, these application records have been drilled down to the location, whether or not the location complies with our zoning requirements, our rules and regulations, and you have site control, and then the attestations and the indemnification agreement. So we've really tried to streamline this process so that once folks submit the application and they have to have that executed lease or property deed, we can process the application record and issue a notice of completion or a notice of complete application as quickly as possible. And a little bit of our nomenclature has changed. So The notice of complete application is the new nomenclature for a submitted application. So all of the fees have been paid and all of the applicable forms, documents, and information have been uploaded to the annual license record so that we can begin to prepare the DCR report to make a recommendation as to whether or not to issue a license for that specific location. As I mentioned, we did create a pathway for temporary approval within the annual license application process. In order to receive temporary approval, in addition to the documents listed on the prior slide, you would have to provide evidence of an active state provisional license or annual license. You would have to submit your initial inspection application attestation because you will have to pass an initial inspection in order to receive temporary approval. And you'll have to submit your temporary approval attestation, which states that you meet all the requirements to be issued temporary approval. You know, as the state and the city continue to build out the annual licensing process, there may be a need in the future for DCR to request additional information and or documents from the applicant, and we can do so at any time during the application process. Folks that do not submit all of the necessary information, documents, or forms are subject to abandonment. And because we have done a good job in reducing our vacancy rate and we're now below 20%, we do have to hold applicants accountable for making sure they get the information in because we do have mandated processing timelines for a lot of the records now. So now applicants can not only submit an annual license application after temporary approval has been issued, but they can immediately go into the process once the pre-application review record has been deemed eligible for further processing. And I'll go through this in a few slides. So the first step of the annual license application process is once you've created your annual license application is to make sure that you've uploaded the required forms and you've paid the applicable fees. Certain applicants are going to benefit from the local jurisdiction assistance grant, which will be providing fee waivers for businesses that have active provisional licenses and temporary approval to help facilitate getting them to annual licensure. We will be reviewing records upon submission to determine whether or not the applicant qualifies for a fee waiver. We will also be reviewing all of the forms to determine if the application is complete. And once we've determined that the application is complete and the fees, if applicable, have been paid, we will be sending a notice of complete application within 30 days. And then from there, it's going to be making the recommendation or beginning the community meeting process so that we can move forward with making a recommendation to issue an annual license, if applicable, for that specific applicant or licensee. Just to summarize what the application process for the retail storefront businesses will look like is the applicant will submit a complete annual application, including their environmental document. The department will review to determine if it is complete. If complete, we'll send a notice of complete application to the applicant, the closest neighborhood council, and the relevant city council office. For the retail storefront only, DCR must hold a community meeting to solicit public input on the proposed business premises. And then within 90 days of determining the application is complete, DCR either has to deny the application or make a recommendation to the Cannabis Regulation Commission to grant an annual license. And if DCR's recommendation is to grant an annual license, the commission must hold a public hearing to determine whether to grant the annual license. So for the retail storefront activity, there are some distinct steps that will be occurring. So within 30 days of receiving your notice of complete application, DCR will have to be sending an email to the applicant, the relevant city council district, the neighborhood council, and if applicable, the closest business improvement district. Applicants will be required to pay a community meeting fee within 30 days of the invoice. The community meeting fee is a requirement for folks that do not have existing temporary approval or they do not have an active provisional license. Again, the local jurisdiction assistance grant will be providing fee waivers to certain applicants through this process to facilitate converting from provisional licensure into annual licensure. But for new businesses coming online that did not previously get temporary approval or a provisional license, they may not be eligible to receive these grant funds per the state. The applicant will be required to reach out to the neighborhood council within 10 days of receiving their notice of a complete application, and they'll have to provide DCR with written evidence of their offer to appear. Businesses are required to reach out to the neighborhood council and offer to participate in one of their meetings. However, if the neighborhood council doesn't schedule you, they don't want to hear from you, they can't schedule you in a timely manner, that does not preclude DCR from continuing to move forward with processing your application and or making a recommendation to issue an annual license. You just need to provide evidence that you offer to appear before the neighborhood council, and that's it. Within 45 days of receiving that notice of complete application, DCR will conduct a community meeting. We have to provide notice in advance of the community meeting date. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a standing calendar. So as records are deemed complete, we will automatically agendize them for the next community meeting within that area planning commission area. So within the city, there's a series of area planning commissions, which are, made up of multiple community planning areas. So basically, any application that is deemed complete within a community plan area that makes up that area planning commission will go to the same community meeting once we've issued that notice of complete application. And we will be providing additional information there so folks can understand what that process is going to look like. But it's going to be very similar to the way DCR administered the pilot program for the public convenience or necessity process, where applications that were deemed complete within a given community plan area were all processed and moved forward for further consideration at the same time, so that folks have the opportunity to weigh in on that geographic area together. And it makes it a little bit more efficient for applicants as well as community members to provide that public input. At these meetings, we will be accepting written and oral testimony regarding the applications that are on the agenda, and then staff will prepare a written summary and provide that report to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. All of these meetings will be virtual, so folks will have the opportunity to log in, and it's our intent to the extent possible to try to, administer these meetings in the evening so that we can get maximum public participation. And then, of course, within 90 days of that notice of complete application, DCR will either recommend to the commission to issue the annual license or deny the issuance of the annual license with no hearing. If we do deny the issuance of the annual license, there is the ability to appeal that determination to the Cannabis Regulation Commission, or to appeal it to a hearing officer, depending on why the record was denied. For all intents and purposes, going back to the last slide, if there's a reason to deny an application, DCR would most likely deny the application instead of making a recommendation to deny the issuance of an annual license to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. It's more efficient for not only the applicant, but also for the department, that if we do find grounds to deny an application, that it gets denied at the earliest possible opportunity, as to not prolong the process. And the Cannabis Regulation Commission has to approve the issuance of an annual license. based on DCR's recommendation, the evidence in the record, and after conducting a public hearing. And after the close of a 15-day appeal period, the commission's decision is final. As part of these commission reports, the commission will be taking up not only the recommendation to issue an annual license, but they'll also be taking up the discretionary action tied to the environmental report for that annual license. So they'll have the ability to adopt both the environmental report and the recommendation to issue the annual license as part of the same agenda, so that once the appeal periods have run, those documents can be deemed complete. For all other license types, basically delivery and non-retail businesses, applicants will submit their complete application. We'll review to determine if it's complete. If it's complete, we send a notice of complete application to the applicant, the closest neighborhood council, and the relevant city council office. And then DCR will basically prepare a report and submit the report to the executive director, who has the authority to grant or deny annual licenses. So for everything other than retail storefront, it's going to be a significantly more streamlined process. For applicants that are vertically integrated, specifically the phase one businesses, you will have basically a bifurcated route. On one hand, the director will have the ability to consider the issuance of an annual license for any of your non-retail activities, cultivation, non-volatile manufacturing, distribution, et cetera, and then adopt the environmental report tied to that action. And then the recommendation to issue an annual license for the retail storefront, plus the environmental report that encompasses not only the non-retail, but also the retail storefront activity, would go to the Cannabis Regulation Commission for consideration. So for vertically integrated applicants that have the retail storefront license type, you will go through two decision-making processes. One is for delivery and non-storefront activities, which will go to the director. And then the other is for the retail storefront activity only, that'll go to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. The state is aware that the activity types will be bifurcated going through the approval process. And we will be making this information available to the state. So if they are considering issuing you a corresponding state annual license for either delivery or the non-retail activities, they're able to do that earlier in the process than having to wait for everything to get adopted. And now I'm going to preview what the annual license application record looks like within the DCR licensing portal. It's going to be very familiar to folks that have utilized the portal before. When you go into the portal and you look at your list of records, and you can see for our DCR test accounts, we've got a number of records here. The record down here at the bottom that says action required, you can see that it's a pre-application review record that is deemed eligible for further processing. So when you click on action required, what it's going to do is it's going to take you directly into the annual application. The first page that you'll see is the legal business name and fictitious business name for the applicant. At the bottom of this page, you'll also see the corresponding business premises address. These fields will be locked and you will not be able to modify them going into the annual licensing process. If you're a sole proprietor and you're looking to convert your pre-application review record from a sole proprietorship into a legal business entity, you'll have to make that modification before you submit your annual license application, so that we can go ahead and make sure that your annual license record is nested under the legal business entity for whatever business entity is going to be pursuing that license. Once you verified the legal entity and the address, you'll get to the contact page. From here, you've got a couple of different options. One of the options is to look up. To look up another user, You can use their ACA reference ID. You can find those IDs on a lot of the ownership primary personnel forms that you would fill out in advance. As part of the annual license application, we're looking for you to identify folks that are location specific. The neighborhood liaison, the person in charge of that location. Do you have a security company, a management company, a law firm, an accounting firm, other folks that are location specific for the record? So you can add those contacts. You also have the ability to select from the account. When you click select from the account, whatever ACA reference ID is associated with the logged in user going through this process, it'll populate that. So on the next couple of slides, you'll see what happens when you click on some of these buttons. So we're going to start with the lookup. So if you click on the lookup contact, it'll ask you what type of contact, and then will ask you for the ACA reference ID. For the lookup contact types, there's two. There's individuals. That's like me, social equity owners, other folks. And then there's organization. That's for business entities. So you'll select the correct contact type. And then once you've done that, you'll have the ability to fill in the ACA reference ID. Once you have those two fields filled out, you'll click on lookup. If it has a match, what'll happen is it'll display the name for the account here, and then it'll ask you what type of contact you want to assign to it. So again, I've highlighted some of the ones that you can pick from: accounting firm, consultant, consultant entity, management company, person in charge, security firm. Every record has to have a neighborhood liaison. So you need to make sure you at least select a neighborhood liaison in order to move off of the contacts tab. So for our purposes, that's what I'm going to select here. Alternatively, you can select from the account. And when you select from the account, you can see here, contact from account. It'll show the name that's logged into the system completing this record. It's the same account. And then it'll ask you to select the type. When you select the type, it's only going to ask you to select the type of contact you want to add, because it already knows whether or not the contact that's logged in is an individual or organization. So again, we're going to do the neighborhood liaison here. When you select the neighborhood liaison, that'll populate. You can continue to either look up or select from the account to add other contact types to the record. If you make a mistake and you need to remove something, you can just click on the delete button here, and then it'll erase that line from the form. Once you've filled out your contacts for that particular location, you can go ahead and click continue. Then it's going to basically just provide you an overview of the use and the activities associated with that record. So for this test record, we've selected adult and medical. You're not going to be able to change it. It's going to be whatever information was submitted as part of the pre-application review record. When you click on continue, it'll show the individual activities that are associated with the record. Again, these all come from either your temporary approval record or from the pre-application review record that was previously deemed eligible for further processing. Again, you're not going to be able to make any changes here other than to uncheck an activity that you no longer want to pursue. Once you've reviewed and you've unchecked any activities you no longer want to pursue, you can click continue. You're going to get to the document upload page. For new applicants coming in, we are going to be creating a new annual form that consists of all of the different attestations, indemnification agreements, and application-specific data that needs to be submitted. So you can submit it as part of one document upload. When you've submitted your documents, if you need to supplement the documents, when the record is set to waiting for payment, at the end of the process, that gives you the ability to go back into the record and upload additional documents to it. But we did want to make this process a little bit more streamlined so that folks that were prepared to upload everything as part of one document could do that. And then folks that wanted to submit multiple documents would have the opportunity to just upload one document as part of this. And then once they've submitted the record, go back into it and upload any additional documents that they want or documents that may have forgotten to upload. This form will be available on DCR's website within the next 2 weeks. Our initial focus, of course, is transitioning folks that are already in the pipeline from their temporary approval record status into the annual application status so that we can, work with them to help meet the upcoming state requirements. When you click on the add button here, it'll give you a prompt to upload a document. You can see here that I've uploaded the test document. It'll give you confirmation that the document was uploaded successfully. Once you've uploaded the document, you can click continue, and then it will give you the ability just to review all of the information that you've uploaded to date. So this is the application summary page. Once you're done reviewing the information, you click continue. It'll take you to the fees page. You'll notice that you're not being charged for the fire inspection fee. That was really tied to the temporary approval application process. Again, as part of the annual license application process, you don't have to demonstrate compliance with LEFD, building and safety, public health, or the state process until after we've made a determination to issue you an annual license. But you will need to do that before you're eligible for a final inspection and to receive your operating permit. So folks will get invoiced for the annual license application fees for each of the activities on this record or on their record. So this record had 4 activities. So it's got the 4 annual license application fees. Once you continue from this page, it'll assess the fees on the record. Again, certain applicants are going to be eligible for fee waivers. Once the fees have been assessed, DCR staff within 5 days will review the record to determine if it's eligible for a fee waiver. If it is, they'll go ahead and apply the fee waiver. If it's not, you will have to pay the invoice within the 30 days that are listed on the invoice. And then once you click continue from the fee screen, you'll get a confirmation that the application was submitted. The core record number, which is the 6-digit number here, for existing applicants will be the same core number as what you were issued, unless you previously bifurcated your activities across multiple records, in which case we will change the 2nd digit of the record so that you have the same starting number, last 4 numbers, but then the 2nd digit will reflect that it's another record that spawned off of whatever your original phase record was. And when we have some examples of that later on, it'll be easier to explain. But the intent here is really to keep this core number the same as your historical records, because when you're working with your analyst, it makes it easier to kind of look at your records together so that if you need to add information or there's changes that need to be applied, the analyst can look at all of the records together. And then, of course, once you've submitted it, again, the record will default to waiting for payment. If there's additional information that you have to submit, you can click on the view record details. And then from there, it'll take you into the record and you'll have the ability to upload additional documents. Now I'm just going to briefly go over some of the additional stuff if you're going to be requesting temporary approval as part of your annual license application. The annual license process does have a workflow to allow for us to issue temporary approval. In order to issue temporary approval, DCR needs to have evidence of an active state provisional license or annual license. You'll need to submit the initial inspection attestation, the temporary approval attestation. You'll have to pass an initial inspection, and we need to make sure that you have no outstanding fire life safety orders or permitting issues. For folks that go through the annual licensing process and don't get temporary approval or who allow their temporary approval to expire, you will have to get an operating permit. And, folks can only operate with an annual license and an operating permit or an active temporary approval. To obtain an operating permit from DCR, a licensee has to pass a DCR final inspection. They have to submit all of the permits, clearances, licenses, and other authorizations required by law. Some examples include the Department of Building and Safety, certificate of occupancy, if applicable, fire permits, and your public health permit. For the retail storefronts, in addition to getting your health permit, you also have to get your emblem placard from the LA County Department of Public Health. The final inspection is a required inspection of the business premises that's conducted after DCR issues an annual license and prior to being able to utilize that annual license. Operating permits are site-specific as well as licensee-specific. A final inspection checklist is going to vary based on the activities that are licensed at the location. So a business that is only engaged in a retail storefront would have a different checklist than somebody who's engaged in retail storefront and cultivation. So as we get to this and we start deeming applications complete, you'll be able to work with the inspection and compliance team to identify what requirements they'll be checking for as part of this final inspection process. Again, for the retail storefront licensees, you will have to make sure that you have your emblem and health permit from the LA County Department of Public Health. If you haven't already started to work with them, I recommend clicking on the link once this has been published so you can start getting into their process so that this doesn't hold you back from getting your operating permit once you've gotten your annual license. Operating permits are not transferable or assignable to another person or a location. If a licensee relocates, the licensee must pass a final inspection at the new location to receive a new operating permit. One of the other changes that we did as part of this ordinance amendment was allowing for the annual license to be transferable and be used as collateral in business transactions. So an annual license upon issuance can be bought and sold. And that's going to streamline the transference process between entities. Previously, a license could not be transferred. And what happened was, in order to facilitate, moving a license from entity A to entity B, it was an entity substitution process where entity A notified DCR that it wanted to give its application opportunity to entity B. Entity B had to be vetted, submit an application, and then meet the application licensing requirements for that location. And when they were determined to meet those requirements, entity A would cancel their license, which facilitated DCR issuing a license to entity B. Although people may characterize it as a transfer, it wasn't a transfer. It was two separate application processes versus once an annual license has been issued, we're going to be able to actually transfer that license from entity A to entity B. Entity B won't have to go through a new application process. Entity B will just have to pass a final inspection in order to receive their operating permit for that location. So that's a huge change.
So we'll start with our first question from MS. Can an EMMD who is grandfathered at a non-compliant location, one, relocate its retail while leaving other activities parked at the original address? Sorry. And then two, continue to operate retail activities at the original license location for the next 12 to 18 months, or as long as needed, while it goes through the city and state annual application process. If you needed me to repeat any part of that, please let me know.
So phase one applicants or existing medical marijuana dispensaries just like any other business, have the ability to relocate one or more of their activities to a compliant location. So if an applicant was looking to relocate retail, they would submit a modification request, identify a new proposed location, and then go through the process. If the location is eligible for further processing, they would have the opportunity to submit the business premises relocate, basically pay the business premises relocation fee to plant their flag at the new location and start their application at the new location. For businesses that do go through the business premises relocation, they have 180 days where they can basically continue to operate at their existing location while they're working toward licensure at the new location. If after the 180 days, there's not another applicant that would be impacted by them continuing to operate at the location, DCR has the authority to renew their continued activity in 90-day increments until such time that they're either ready to move completely over to the new location or renewal of their activity would negatively impact or prevent another applicant from moving forward. So you could continue to operate the retail activities at the original location for 6 months, and your ability to continue beyond that is really going to be dependent on whether or not it would impact another prospective applicant.
Okay, I think we can move on. The next question comes from David P. And his question is, can a social equity tier 1 applicant open multiple locations under the same license without the need of an additional applicant?
So when somebody talks about tier 1, it's assumed that they're talking about a business entity, which means that the business entity has one or more social equity individual applicants that have 51% or more of the equity in that business. So that business can apply at multiple locations under the same entity. They will have to pay application fees for each of the additional locations and license types that they want to pursue, but they wouldn't have to go through a new equity share review for the legal business entity because it's already been vetted. They would only have to go through a new review if they change the owners or indirect owners associated with that entity.
Jason, were you done with that question or did you cut out?
I was done with that question.
Okay, sorry about that. Our next question comes from Ariella J. For fee waivers that DCR will issue for active provisional licenses and active TAs, is this only for SEIAs or all applicants, including phase 1 and phase 2?
It's for all eligible applicants and licensees. So we're working with the state to ensure that the folks that are eligible for these fee waivers, we will get reimbursement from the state. But it's general applicants and social equity individual applicants.
Okay, our next question comes from MS. If an EMMD submits for a relocation modification right now, their only path to licensure is to receive an annual license approval from LA, correct? And then I'll ask this other questions after.
So it's going to come down to the timing. So if the phase 1 business, or any business for that matter, currently has temporary approval, and now they're trying to relocate, and they've missed the, state deadline to submit for a new provisional license, they would have to go through the state's annual license process. That said, with the amendments that just became law last Friday, DCR does have the ability to relocate an annual license to a new location. And then, assuming that the new location complies, the environmental analysis could move with the license to that new location, which would mean that the business could have an adopted environmental document in order to qualify for their state annual license. So if you only have TMP, you'll have to go through the annual license process and get your adopted environmental in order to meet the state requirements. If you get your city annual license before you submit the modification request, you would be able to move the license with the environmental, and then basically notify the state that you've got your adopted environmental for that location for those activities, so that either you can modify your state annual license or possibly move an existing TMP to the new location.
And then the follow-up question to that, assuming that this individual needs to go through the annual license process from DCR, how long does DCR foresee this process taking? If the applicant is on top of things and does everything necessary as fast as possible, let's assume the location will be eligible for CEQA categorical exemption.
So the fastest I foresee this process going is 3 to 6 months. For the non-retail, the director has the ability to review the staff report and make a determination of whether or not to issue the annual license and adopt the environmental findings. For the retail storefronts, we do have to do the community meetings. There's notice requirements. We have to make the referrals for the Cannabis Regulation Commission, and we have to publicly notice those public hearings as well. So there's processes and timelines in play that may push it beyond 6 months for the retail storefront activity. But assuming that the location could be eligible for the categorical exemption, that's excellent. And at the same time, with the code amendment, the applicant could hire their own consultant to do the environmental review and then submit that environmental report to DCR, which may reduce the processing time to get to a notice of complete application to move it forward. So that's an additional perk from the amended ordinance, is allowing the applicant to do their own environmental review and submit that report for DCR consideration.
This next question also comes from MS, and there's a two-parter, but I'll ask it all together. Can Los Angeles issue a CEQA exemption and DCR subsequently issue temporary approval without the applicant meeting all of the requirements of an annual license? The second part, would the CEQA exemption docs, which DCR would provide in this situation, be sufficient for a state annual license?
So as part of our local annual licensing process, we will be adopting environmental findings, which will likely include CEQA exemptions for some of our existing businesses. We, as part of a complete application, DCR could, adopt those findings, make a recommendation to issue the license. If the applicant can demonstrate that they have an active provisional license then they could be eligible for temporary approval prior to getting their annual license and meeting the requirements to get their operating permit. If they don't have an active state license, we could make the recommendation to issue the license. The decision maker could issue the annual license. We adopt the environmental findings. They meet the requirements to get into the state queue. They get their state annual license, and then they come back to DCR and demonstrate that they have an active license, and they may be eligible to get temporary approval while they work towards meeting the requirements to pass a final inspection and get an operating permit. So there's different possibilities and pathways, but you will have to have an adopted environmental report, whether it's a CEQA exemption or something else, before you can meet the requirements for the state's annual licensing process.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Jesse F. When is the latest date you can submit an application for temporary approval?
So we're no longer going to be accepting or working on temporary approval applications from social equity applicants, specifically beginning on July 31st. For general applicants, we're no longer accepting temporary approval applications, and we're in the process of migrating any existing temporary approval applications into the annual application process. Again, there could be a pathway to receive temporary approval through an annual application workflow, provided that you can provide evidence of an active state provisional license or state annual license. But businesses are not going to be able to qualify for local temporary approval without corresponding evidence of a state license.
Okay, Ariella J has this additional question. For existing TA records, will the previously submitted TA form suffice, or will the new 5,000 form need to be completed as part of the annual application?
It's really going to depend on the age of the form and whether or not it's in kind of the most current form type. So some of the businesses haven't uploaded new forms since 2018. Those forms are all going to be out of date, and they're going to need to be updated, whether it's through the existing forms or the new 5,000 form. For businesses that got temporary approval and met the requirements and their forms are less than 6 months old or 12 months old, those forms may suffice. And then, of course, as part of the annual renewal process, they could get us the updated forms. If you have a question, I would ask you to reach out to your analyst. For the annual forms, that 5,000 form is really intended for folks that are transitioning from the pre-application review into the annual application process. So they haven't submitted any of the old temporary approval forms. So it's basically a fresh start. For the TA forms, we're really looking for the attestations, the indemnification agreements, the proposed business premises, the evidence of site control, and then of course your completed form 4013. So if you have completed the existing TA forms and they're less than 12 months old, you can probably get them uploaded to the ANN record once it's created. And if the analyst in their review determines that we need either a current version of the form or a newer version of the form, they would reach out to you before we deem the application complete.
Our next question comes from Kimber W. Does DCR know if there are specific use codes for the Department of Building and Safety's certificate of occupancy?
We don't have, okay, so there's two caveats there. The commercial cannabis activity is not an enumerated use within the city. So there's not a specific code tied to commercial cannabis activity. What building and safety does is they look at the activities the business is engaged in, and then they determine what the primary use is and any accessory or supplemental uses. So if you're a retail storefront, you would need a certificate of occupancy for retail. If you're a retail storefront and you're engaged in cultivation, you may need retail and then a hydroponic enterprise, which cultivation or nursery could fall under. So really they'll take a look at not only what you're applying for with DCR, but what activities you're engaged in and kind of how that fits within the existing certificate of occupancy, or whether or not you may need to amend that certificate of occupancy to cover all of the activities that you plan to engage in.
Our next question comes also from Kimber, and it's a bit of a follow-up, but different. And she asked, is there a list of all necessary permits or approvals required?
So the two most basic things are to ensure that your Department of Building and Safety certificate of occupancy aligns with your activities, and then you get your corresponding health permit for all of the activities. And if one of the activities is retail storefront, you also have to get your emblem from the Department of Public Health. When Building and Safety takes a look at your activities, and if you have to go through plan check to update your certificate of occupancy, they would then route you to other city departments that may have a permitting requirement. So if you're engaged in non-volatile manufacturing and you're gonna have equipment that's used for the extraction or infusion activity, you may get routed to the fire department so that they can look at your floor plan, they can look at your equipment, and they can determine whether or not you have any chemicals on site that may require a CUPA permit or some other permit from the fire department. So building and safety is really the gateway into the citywide permitting process. And when they look at something for their purposes, they will basically route the applicant to other city agencies as necessary to update whatever documents that they're pursuing with the Department of Building and Safety. The DCR is completely outside of that process. So when questions and stuff come in, we do refer folks to the Department of Building and Safety directly, so you can talk directly with them about what you're planning to do, or get information about the existing certificate of occupancy and how it may need to be amended to reflect what you want to do at a specific location.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Deb. I am a social equity applicant. In January 2025, if I have the annual license from the city and state, can I sell the remaining 34% to my non-social equity partner?
So social equity records continue to be social equity records even beyond January of 2025. So you would be able to submit an ownership modification, and in order for DCR to process it, it would still have to comply with the requirements under Municipal Code Section 10420. So if you have to have 33 1/3%, or you have to make, like social equity individual applicants have to have a 51% ownership stake in the applicant for it to comply, that's what we'd be looking at. So if you have other social equity partners that are helping to meet whatever the equity share requirement is for your particular record, you may have the ability to go through an ownership modification once a license has been issued to sell your interest. But depending on what that equity share requirement is and who else is on the record, we may or may not be able to process an ownership modification.
Okay, we have a couple questions from Ally. She submitted it as one, but I'm breaking it up in two to make it easy. And the question is, I have a temporary license since December 2021, and my annual has not been updated to upload my information. Are updates still forthcoming? Also, I have not been able to get a provisional license due to CEQA and being a non-social equity applicant. I don't believe I saw what a temporary license will need to upload.
So we are still converting records from the temporary approval process to the annual application process. Records do need a legal business entity record before they can be converted, because the legal business entity record is the parent of all the application and licensing records. So we're working with the Excella team right now for the records that don't have a legal business entity that they can be attached to identify the fields to create the legal business entity on behalf of the applicant, so that then we can create the annual application record and nest it under that legal business entity. So if you do not have temporary approval, regardless of whether or not you have a legal business entity record, you didn't meet the requirements for us to do the conversion back on May 1st. And we are working with Excella to either create a legal business entity record or to identify the TMP records that will need to then be nested under the legal business entity record. And we will be making updates over the next week or 2 weeks to continue to facilitate that as the information becomes available. So if it hasn't been converted within 2 weeks, I would reach out to your assigned analyst. But again, we will be doing updates for the remainder of this week and next week as we do this migration.
Okay, Ally's follow-up question, the criteria for being waived fees, what is the consideration? Because I think I have a good case for being considered. Please and thank you.
So the consideration is gonna be solely based on what the state is willing to accept as part of the local jurisdiction grant assistance award. The LJAG funds were intended to convert people from provisional licensure into annual licensure. We had submitted a modification to request that we could use those funds for all applicants and licensees pursuing annual licensure. And, they're reviewing the request, but they did give us some feedback that based on their understanding of these grant funds, folks had to be in the provisional application queue in order to be eligible for DCR to utilize these funds for their benefit. So, ultimately it's going to come down to what the state approves as part of our budget submission packet and whether or not they, in looking at our data, say that there's a corresponding record on the state side that would allow for that business to be eligible for a fee waiver.
Our next question comes from Tony P. If starting from scratch, what is the likelihood of getting a permit issued for retail with and without a social equity component?
I don't completely understand the question. So right now, in order to apply for the retail activity, whether it's retail storefront or delivery, you can only submit an application if you are applying as a social equity applicant. In January of 2025, the process will open up to all applicants. So in a nutshell, currently, there's not a path to receive a retail license, whether it's storefront or delivery, without meeting the social equity components.
Okay, you ready for the next one, Jason?
Yeah.
Okay. And this one comes from your namesake, Jason. Here's the question. Is DCR working with building and safety to understand the backlog of plan submittals that have not been fully approved or have been lost due to COVID? If so, is DCR allowing extension based on these delays? We've been going through the plan check and still waiting for plans approved. Does DCR need these approvals to sign off on an annual permit?
So part of the reason why we recommended material changes to the municipal code was we understand that COVID had an impact on everybody, and specifically businesses that were working with other city agencies, that caused delays or materials not being delivered on time, et cetera. So we did amend the code to allow for us to continue to renew temporary approval through calendar year 2027, so that it gives people more time that have qualified for temporary approval to operate under the temporary approval while they try to meet the requirements to get their operating permit that would be tied to the annual license. The other big thing we did is, under the old law, you had to qualify and pass the final inspection to get your annual license. Under the new law, we've shifted that burden until after the annual license has been issued. So DCR can deem an application complete and issue an annual license without you having met all of the permitting requirements. Before you get your operating permit, you'll have to meet all of those permitting requirements, pass a final inspection to get the operating permit, but you could get your annual license and continue to, renew your temporary approval so that you can continue to operate while you work with building and safety and fire and other agencies on meeting all of those permitting requirements. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Jason. The next question I'm going to ask as written, but they might be confusing different departments, but I'll let you figure that out. This one comes from Peter. Is the health department emblem required to continue doing business after this year, or will we be given time to work with building and safety? And this goes for all license types.
So a health permit from the LA County Department of Public Health is required for all license types. In addition to the health permit, if your business is engaged in the retail storefront activity, you'll have to meet the requirements to receive your emblem, which kind of goes hand in hand with meeting the health permit requirements for the retail storefront activity. You can receive a health permit for one or more activities without meeting the requirements for all of the activities that you may have at your location. With the caveat that you'll still have to get those permits in order to qualify for the final inspection for that activity and get your operating permit for that activity. We encourage people to engage with public health as soon as possible. We do understand that it may require you to update your certificate of occupancy or to go through different building, tenant improvements, which may require a building permit before you can qualify. And we've tried to embed additional time to allow you to do that. So you can continue to renew your temporary approval without having your health permit, but you can't pass your final inspection until you have your health permit.
Okay, our next question from Ariella J. For a location that is grandfathered into a non-compliant zone until 2025, can that license submit the annual at the existing location?
Simple answer, yes.
Okay, moving on. This one comes from Katie. When can non-retail licenses with temporary approval expect to obtain their DCR annual license if the annual license application is submitted and fees are paid within the next 60 days? I'm sorry, 30 days.
It will probably be within 3 to 6 months.
Okay, question from MS. Please confirm when the 180 days start and would qualify as impacting another applicant. Is it safe to assume that there has to be submitted pre-app from another applicant in order for the EMMD to be prevented from extending their stay at its initial location? I'll stop there.
So the 180 days would start when the business premises relocation fee is paid. So that's really when you've acknowledged that you do want to move forward with the relocation, and we create a new application at your new preferred location. For the 180 days, once that clock has started, it's going to come down to whether or not there is a competing application that would fall within 700 feet of your original location. So somebody could go through the pre-app process after you've indicated that you plan to move, and we could deem that pre-application eligible for further processing. Folks have up to a year to submit their application from that point. So if they haven't submitted the application and DCR is not going to be in a position to issue a license, then we would have the ability to continue to allow the EMMD to extend their stay or renew in 90-day increments. But once the other applicant would submit an application, DCR is on the clock to process that application and make a determination of whether or not to issue a license. So, generally that will take 3 to 6 months, which is why after that initial 180 days, we're only going to allow for extensions in 90-day increments, so that if another application comes in, renewing your license at the location wouldn't preclude us from issuing a license to the new applicant that's moving within your original 700-foot buffer.
Okay, and you may have answered this, but I want to be sure that this person gets their question answered. How soon would the existing medical marijuana dispensary be notified by DCR, if at all, that there is another prospective applicant that has submitted a pre-app and that the EMMD stay will be coming to an end?
So these are great questions. So we're working with the Excella team to automate the updating of the DCR licensing map with the hope of getting it updated with retail storefront application information in a more timely manner. When we deem your business premises location eligible for further processing, you get invoiced for the business premises relocation fees. If you don't pay those fees, then the modification gets deemed abandoned and we revert back to your original location. If you pay the fees, you're on the clock from the date that we deem that business premises eligible for further processing. So on kind of the notification, you'll know what the 180th day would be. And as we get closer to the 180 days, we'll notify you as to your option to renew for a 90-day increment. And of course, if there's another business there that's submitting an application, you wouldn't get the option of renewing beyond the 180 days or whatever 90-day extension you were previously granted.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Anai. We have a state license application that is waiting for CEQA determination from DCR. It has been pending for a while. The state has given us until July to provide evidence of CEQA, and we have submitted the project-specific information to DCR. How soon can DCR notify the state of CEQA so we can begin operating? Jason, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here, and I was answering this wonderful question, and I'm not going to be able to remember my amazing answer. So you'll have to take what I remember of it. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's really going to depend on where this record is in the local process. So under the old code, you had to receive temporary approval before DCR had the authority to start reviewing your project-specific information form and working on your draft environmental report. And once we had completed our draft, then we had the ability to allow people into the annual application process. If people didn't have a temporary approval, even if they had submitted that form, we didn't have the authority to work on it or process it. So if you have an annual application record already, please make sure that you have your project-specific information form uploaded, because we are beginning to issue the notices of completion, which is CEQA speak for draft environmental report. We're working with the state licensing agency to upload those draft findings in advance of adopting that report at the local level as part of our annual application process. So this is going to be one of those cases where it's going to be best for you to reach out to your analyst in order to understand where you are in the local process and how quickly your environmental document could be adopted for the state's purposes. And of course, because of the dual licensing requirement, just getting a state license doesn't relieve you of the need to also have your local license, whether it's temporary approval or an annual license plus an operating permit. And I'm done with that one.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Allie R. Where do we go to start the certificate of occupancy process for a distribution activity? Do we make an appointment? Is there a specific department within LADBS for cannabis-related certificate of occupancy?
So in the tower across from DCR, the 201 tower of Fig Plaza, building and safety and other departments have public counters, and then they have what they refer to as the development services one-stop shop. And if you go there or you call them, they can give you assistance with answering certificate of occupancy related questions and whether or not the certificate of occupancy for your preferred location would allow for the distribution activity. They do allow people to make appointments, but that would be handled through their department. There are 2 authorized positions to kind of provide cannabis related assistance, but there's not like a specific unit within their development services center that just focuses on cannabis activities. Because cannabis is not an enumerated use, they really look at the activity and how that activity kind of fits within other general activities, whether it's retail, whether or not you're operating a warehouse, what are you storing at the warehouse? Do you need to maintain a fleet? Are you growing plants? Are you utilizing chemicals? What type of equipment are you using? Those are all things that they look at. And they'll probably need to ask you some questions about how you plan to operate in order to determine whether or not the existing CFO is sufficient or whether or not it needs to be amended.
Okay, our next question from MS. Is it safe to assume that an EMMD, which is in a CPA that is capped, can keep operating at their initial location for as long as needed while they work on getting their new location operational? How would we be able to determine if there are any pending PCN apps in that CPA and have any PCN apps been approved in LA?
So I'll answer the PCN question first. So the city council made a public convenience or necessity finding for 5 PCN applicants. At this time, only one of the PCN applicants has received temporary approval and can operate. And they're located within the Central City Community Plan area. I don't think it's safe to assume that a phase 1 business located in a community plan that's unduly concentrated could keep operating at their initial location, because other licensees within that CPA also have the option to relocate. So you could have a competitor that wants to backfill your location that could also submit a relocation. Once you've paid your business premises relocation fees and that gets updated on the map, they may think that your location, your old location or original location, is better than their current location, and they may seek to relocate. So, you really have to understand which licensees are operating within your area and how them deciding to change their business practices could be, initiated because you've decided to make a change with yours. It's really too hard because it's purely speculative, but I wouldn't assume that you could keep operating for beyond the 180 days just because other folks within that area may have the ability to relocate.
Okay, the next question comes from Paul T. Do you know of any realtors that lease to cannabis dispensaries?
DCR doesn't maintain any of that information or even collect it. The social equity team does a lot of community outreach and stakeholder outreach. So when they do various stakeholder events, there may be an opportunity to meet realtors at those events and share information to find compliant locations and or landlords that would be willing to lease to a cannabis business.
Our next question comes from Kimber W. What are the requirements for DCR's list of approved locations on its website that are approved to get a site evaluation from DPH? Does that mean that those locations have a valid certificate of occupancy, or what makes them eligible for approval?
So the existing licensees are, eligible to go through the site evaluation process with LA County Department of Public Health. The ability to begin the site evaluation process is solely based on the fact that the business has received temporary approval. It does not mean that they have a valid certificate of occupancy. It just means that they've been issued a license, and in order to qualify for a final inspection, they're going to need to get their health permit. Public health does rely upon building and safety and verification of the certificate of occupancy. So once you've initiated the process through public health, you will get routed to building and safety. And if they determine that your certificate of occupancy doesn't align with your activities, they're not going to clear the issuance of the public health permit until such time your certificate of occupancy is updated.
Okay. Our next question from Tony P. Is there a way to get in line for the application review process, which will begin for general applicants in January 2025?
Prospective applicants have the ability to request a business tax registration certificate, and once one of those has been issued, they can create their legal business entity record and pay the fees associated with vetting the entity and the owners and primary personnel of that entity. Once you have the legal business entity record created, you have the ability to begin the pre-application review process. And those are all prerequisites before actually submitting an application to DCR.
Okay. The next question comes from Tamika D. Can SEIAs transfer ownership to an individual or entity that is not an SEIA for license types currently available to the general population, for example, distribution and manufacturing?
The simple answer is no. So the license is either a general license or a social equity license. So if temporary approval has been issued to a social equity applicant and that applicant has met the equity share requirements, when we do an entity substitution, effectively you're just giving an entity the ability to take your application slot in the DCR queue. But for distribution, non-volatile manufacturing, since those are open to general applicants and social equity applicants, effectively the general applicant could just as easily start the pre-application review process and then submit an application. And then, effectively apply for their own license because they got to meet the licensing requirements in order to get licensed under that entity's name. So there's not a way to do an entity substitution from a social equity applicant to a general applicant, even for activities that are not restricted to social equity applicants.
Okay, moving on. Allie R. asked, will the state give us an annual operation without permits while we continue to work on permits? Please clarify. Additionally, for completion of CEQA to get sent to the state for a license to be operational for a temporary license, how long would the process take?
So just like the DCR, the Department of Cannabis Regulation, at the state level, the Department of Cannabis Control is one agency that is focused on licensing commercial cannabis activities. So in order to meet the state's requirements, you're going to have a seller's permit. You're going to have to register with the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, and you may need to be able to get other permits from state agencies to have a complete state application. Those are separate and apart from any local permits and licenses you would have to get in order to meet the city's requirements for annual licensure. So you have to have a license issued by DCR as well as a license issued by DCC. You have to meet whatever those agencies' permitting requirements are. And the completion of the CEQA, which is the environmental analysis, is tied to DCR's review of whether or not there's an impact to issuing you a commercial cannabis license. And the adoption of the recommendation to issue the license plus that environmental report leads to the adoption of a final environmental doc, which the state requires as part of their application process. So, you know, there's a possibility for businesses to be operational without an adopted CEQA document, but the state is phasing out their provisional licensing process, and they are requiring people to make significant progress towards compliant with CEQA to continue to renew that provisional license. You know, again, for the non-retail activities, I think it's going to take 3 to 6 months for folks to navigate through the local annual application process. And for businesses pursuing a retail storefront annual license, it could take longer just because of the need for the community meetings, the different notices that are required, and then the Cannabis Regulation Commission to actually conduct the public hearing to consider DCR's report and public input.
Perfect. Okay, moving on. Rafi S asks, we are cultivators with temporary approval. We are in the process of submitting plans to get a conditional use permit and permits from LADBS. Can we continue operating while we are getting our conditional use permit and permits from DBS?
I mean, provided you continue to renew your temporary approval and your state provisional license and or meet the requirements to renew your temporary approval, get a local annual license and get your state annual license, you would be fine as long as building and safety or fire don't cite you for non-compliance. As long as you're working towards meeting the requirements for the final inspection, that would be sufficient for us unless we get notification from building and safety or fire that they've issued you a notice to correct and you haven't addressed that notice to correct.
Our next question or questions from Renee M. Where do we go to update our temporary license? And can we add a distributor license to our micro business license?
So all of our records originate and get modified through the DCR licensing portal. So if you have temporary approval and you need to either update ownership and primary personnel, which you would modify through the legal business entity record, or you need to modify your business premises diagram, your lease, et cetera, which would be on your application record, you would need to initiate that through the portal. There may be an opportunity for you to add the distributor activity type to your local record before your annual application is deemed complete. But it's really going to depend on whether or not that activity is actually compliant with your existing record.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question from MS. How long do SCIAs hold their selected lottery spots? For 1 to 3 years?
So I'm going to overly complicate the answer here. Social equity individual applicants selected through the lottery have up to 1 year to initiate the pre-application review process. So after that 1 year, their lottery record is closed and they either have or they don't have a pre-application review record or some other record that stemmed from the pre-application review record. If somebody submitted the pre-application review record and then they submitted their temporary approval application they paid the applicable fees, they submitted documents, their record was deemed filed, and it later gets abandoned for whatever reason, they have up to 3 years to refile that record pursuant to the refiling rules that were recently adopted and went into effect last Friday. So social equity individual applicants maintain their ability to submit an application tied to their lottery selection for 1 year. And then if they take the opportunity to submit their pre-application record and turn it into an application, if that record is later abandoned, they would have up to the 3 years to refile based on the refiling, the laws around the applicant's ability to refile.
Okay, looks like this might be the last question, and this comes from Rafi S. We have applied for a DCR license and are awaiting CEQA clearance from DCR so that we can apply for the state license. We want to get this done before June 30th to be eligible for the provisional license. Do you know how long this can take?
Again, this would be like an application specific question. I would recommend reaching out to your assigned analyst. If there's a couple of different things happening. So the state had a March 31st deadline for social equity applicants to submit applications for a new provisional license. As DCR has completed the pre-application review process and deemed locations eligible for further processing, we were issuing the local compliance underway letters to let the state know that we had initiated the CEQA review. And, at that point, the applicant was working with the local agency to get the local license. And that has been sufficient to get a new provisional license. Beginning on July 1st, the state has an additional requirement for folks to demonstrate significant progress towards CEQA compliance in order to renew a provisional license. And DCR is beginning to issue a notice of completion, which is CEQA speak for draft environmental report. And the state is aware that those draft environmental reports will go along with a notice of complete application, which is the local annual application, to a decision maker sometime either in the summer or in the fall. So they're aware of that as well. But if you're going to be going through the environmental review and you don't have temporary approval, or you are not a social equity applicant who is trying to meet the state's new provisional license deadline, it may take a couple of months before your draft CEQA report is complete. But I would recommend reaching out to your analyst because it relates to your specific application.
Jason, we have an additional question. I'm not following completely, but you're smarter than I am. MS asks, is it possible for DCR and the Cannabis Commission to initiate conversations with local lawmakers to offer savings programs for local social equity retailers?
I know firsthand that the director has been engaged in conversations with local lawmakers as well as state lawmakers on the taxation issue. And she continues to reach out to try to find ways to reduce the tax burden for our licensees. So it's something that I know for sure she is working on and she understands. And that's all I can say at this time.
Thank you, Jason. We have a few minutes left. We have one additional question. It comes from Katie. Is there specific proof of CEQA compliance from DCR for a licensee already operating under temporary approval required for DCC provisional license renewal application going in this month before 7/1 requirement takes effect.
The simple answer is yes. Similar to DCR having to issue the notices of substantial progress last July so that folks could renew their provisional licenses. The state is moving the bar closer to CEQA compliance and requiring us to notify them that we basically have drafted our environmental report, and we're going to be submitting those findings with the recommendation to issue the annual license. So what we're calling it within our local nomenclature is a notice of completion, which is just CEQA speak for draft environmental document. And for our existing licensees, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, round 1, all of the ones I've reviewed, we've been making recommendations based on a categorical exemption, generally a class 1 and or class 32. So those are going to be posted to the annual records later this month in advance of the July 1st requirement going into effect. And we're working with the state. So the state's going to make it available to us to basically upload these notices of completion directly to them so that they have that evidence on hand, just in case the applicant misses an email or they don't get it in a timely manner.
Thank you, Jason. That was our last question. And looking at the time, we're hitting the mark at about 2 o'clock.
Wonderful. Yeah, and just a reminder to folks, if you haven't already submitted your 4013 forms, we do need you to get them submitted and uploaded to those annual records as quickly as possible. We are trying to get the records done. We are getting notifications from the state in terms of which of our licensees are going to be up to renew their provisional licenses in July and August, and we're prioritizing the review of those 4013 forms, and then we're processing everything else in the order received. We're also in the process of soliciting environmental consultants to help us facilitate the processing of all of these forms if we don't have the capacity to do it in-house. And with that, Gidget, I'd like to say thank you so much. I would hope everybody joins us on Thursday for our crash course webinar number 2. We're going to be focused on the land use review and the mandatory processing timelines. And then next week on Tuesday, June 13th, we're going to do our crash course number 3 on the updated modification request processes. And then, of course, we have our monthly Q&A session on Wednesday, June 13th. And we'll be going through any questions folks have. And I anticipate we'll have a lot of questions related to the crash courses. So thank you, everybody, for taking your time out of today and for your attendance. And I look forward to talking to you at the next either crash course or during the Q&A session.